Introduction. It's not long after sunrise one morning in the early 1980s. I'm 17 years old, and my older brother Mike and I are walking from the outskirts of Newton-le-Willows, where we live with my dad, to our grand council house on Dixon Avenue, near the centre of town, where our mum has lived since the divorce. It's a route we must have taken hundreds of times in the years since my parents split up. Past the Bull's Head pub, down Southworth Road through Naylor's Wood and up the High Street, then past another pub, the Blue Lion, where the band I'm in, FBI, sometimes play. But this morning is different. We're trying to look as inconspicuous as possible, which is easier for me than it is for Mike. Mike is walking the couple of miles to my grand's in a pair of carpet slippers, carrying an 8-inch kitchen knife. I can't really remember what we were talking about as we walked, but presumably we must have touched on what we were going to say if anyone asked us, not unreasonably, why Mike was carrying an 8-inch knife to the centre of Newton first thing on a Wednesday morning. I've no idea what excuse we came up with. Walking around with a kitchen knife anywhere outside of a kitchen is a difficult thing to explain away at the best of times. But clearly we couldn't tell him the truth, because Mike was walking through Newton with the knife that moments ago he'd held at my dad's throat and threatened to murder him with. Life in the Astley household was rarely normal. For one thing, the Astley household didn't in fact live in a house. We lived in a porter cabin in the middle of a field next to my dad's garden centre. It's a long story, which I'll come to in a bit. But even by our standards, it had been quite a morning. I don't know what had started the argument with my dad, but it was almost definitely nothing. That was the thing about Dad's rages. You never knew what was going to set one off. There was no rhyme or reason to them at all. One morning, he'd wake me and my brothers up with a cup of tea. "Oh, it's cold outside, lads. You're going to need this." The next, he'd wake us up by screaming at us, calling us lazy bastards, demanding to know why we weren't out of bed yet. Nothing had changed in the interim, except my dad's mood. He wasn't a caricature, horrible parent, always in a filthy mood. Dad could be generous, funny, encouraging. He wasn't a big drinker, the occasional nip of whiskey in front of the telly at night, the odd night out with his mates at the Conservative Club in town. And even when he did drink, it seemed to put him in a good mood. You'd hear him before he arrived home, singing old Frank Sinatra songs. The kinds of things parents got angry about, bad school reports, stuff like that, didn't seem to bother him at all. Not long before, I'd inadvertently ripped the door off his brand new van. I'd been helping him out at the garden centre, loading stuff into the back of it for a delivery, and reversed off with the passenger door still open, straight into a forklift truck. I think I was paying more attention to what was on the radio than what I was supposed to be doing. When he found out, I held my breath, waiting for the eruption, but it never came. Dad wasn't exactly overjoyed, but he was basically all right about it. But then the explosion would come because he couldn't find the right drill bit he needed, or something daft like that. There would be shouting, stuff would go flying, things would get smashed until they were completely obliterated. It had been going on all my life. It was terrifying when I was younger, but you sort of got used to it as you got older. We didn't ignore it exactly. It's hard to ignore someone who's smashing up a load of terracotta pots with a hammer because he can't find a part for his drill, but we just got out of his way and left him to it. It had almost become a joke between me and Mike and my eldest brother John. Bloody hell, Dad's at it again. This morning, though, it wasn't a joke. He'd completely lost it. I was standing outside our front door when he came up to me, ranting and raving and screaming his head off about something I'd supposedly done. Then he pushed me over and started trying to kick me. The rages I was used to, but this was different. I'd seen him be violent towards my mum once, years ago, but I'd never known him hit any of his kids. Instead, he used to take his anger out on inanimate objects. Until now. Suddenly, I was on the floor and he was trying to kick me. That was when Mike appeared from inside with a knife in his hand. I should say at this point that Mike was definitely not the kind of older brother that you would have expected to spring valiantly to your rescue. He was more the kind of older brother who seemed actively to enjoy tormenting his youngest sibling. When the Astley brothers went to the local air show and got taken up in a plane as a special treat, Mike was the one who turned to me mid-flight and quietly announced that the plane was definitely going to crash. "I don't think the pilot knows what he's doing, Rick. I think he's turned the engine off. I think we're going to die." It was also Mike who was responsible for my lifelong phobia of snakes. I'm terrified of them, to the extent that at one point when we checked into a hotel room, my wife would go through any magazines that were there when we arrived and tear out any pages that had photos of snakes before I saw them. It all started with Mike terrorizing me with one of those jointed toy plastic snakes. He'd hide behind the bedroom door with it, waiting for me to come in. And when I went to secondary school, Mike was the reason teachers always frowned when they heard my surname. "You're not Mike Astley's brother, are you?" When I said I was, they'd roll their eyes. "Oh God, there's another one." In a way, I couldn't blame them. Mike had barely bothered going to secondary school at all. He'd get up every morning, put his snorkel parka on, go in for registration, and then immediately leave. I suppose they had complained to my dad about it, but not turning up for school was also on the list of things that my dad wasn't particularly bothered about. Still, it seemed a bit much. I had barely started school, and my card was already marked. Great. Mike strikes again. This morning was different. When Mike appeared with the knife, he somehow didn't even look like Mike. Mike was the classic surly monosyllabic teenage boy. If they'd had hoodies in the early 80s, his would have been permanently up, but this morning his eyes were dead like a shark's. He looked like someone who'd finally had enough, of living in a porter cabin instead of a proper house, of my dad's rages, of all the stuff he'd quietly ignored or put up with. He walked straight up to my dad, put the knife to his throat, and said calmly but very clearly, "If you fucking move, I will kill you here and now. I will kill you stone dead right now if you move an inch." I got up off the ground and stared at them both. It suddenly felt as if the world had contracted, as if there was only the three of us in it. For a moment, I genuinely thought he was going to do it. It definitely wasn't beyond him. Mike wasn't a scrapper, but he was physically tough. We all were. That's what came of spending hours after school and at the weekends working for my dad, lifting concrete posts and panels for fencing, loading the van, taking stuff out for delivery. And Mike had spent his teenage years giving the distinct impression that he didn't give a shit about anything, with the possible exception of his motorbike. And he even rode that in a way that suggested he didn't think much about the possible consequences of his actions. Plus, he had a knife, and he looked like he'd snapped. Shit. This is actually happening. He's going to murder our dad. The silence could have only been a few seconds, but it seemed to go on forever. Then my dad spoke, breaking the spell. He was still boiling red, but he told us we should leave, which sounded like a better idea than any of the other possible outcomes. Mike lowered the knife, and we left. Mike didn't even put his shoes on. We just went. We somehow managed to arrive at my grand's without anyone noticing us. When we told Mum what had happened, she didn't seem as shocked or horrified as you might expect. For one thing, Mum knew what my dad was like. She'd been married to him. And for another, my mum was as weird as my dad was, in her own way. After the divorce, she did all the things a mum was supposed to do. We went to stay with her for the weekend, and she took us out to the shops, bought us treats, even took us on holiday with her to Blackpool or wherever. But there was something missing, some sort of emotional connection. It's hard to explain exactly what it was, but you knew it wasn't there. It was as if she was behind a pane of glass or something, and it was noticeable even when I was a kid. My parents had split up when I was 4, and I'd stopped going to stay with her at weekends years ago. Still, there was a spare room at my grand's that me and Mike could share, and she said we could stay there as long as we needed to. That still left a question that I didn't have an answer for. What the hell do I do now? I was 17, and as far as I could see, I had no prospects. Living up to the stellar academic standards set by Mike, I'd left school without a single qualification. I didn't bother writing anything at all in any of my O-level exams. I'd simply sat there eating polo mints and staring into space until they said we could leave. There didn't seem to be any point because my future was already mapped out. I was going to work for my dad at the garden centre, like Mike and John had done. But that was suddenly off the cards. So now what? I had no idea. There was the band, FBI. I'd started out as the drummer and ended up as the singer. People said I had a good voice. We had management, and we were big locally, as they say. We could pack them in the Blue Lion and the Lee Arms. But what did that mean? It wasn't as if London record labels were sending platoons of talent scouts out, with firm instructions not to come back until they'd found out what was big in Newton-le-Willows and signed it. Get me that band with the lad from the garden centre on lead vocals, or don't bother coming into work on Monday. Even if they had, I wasn't sure that FBI was going to work. I'd started to sense the other members of the band weren't as committed as I was. It was me that wrote the songs, me that spent hours in front of the telly, analysing and memorising what the bands on the Tube were doing, everything from what instruments they used to how their songs were structured. It was me that drove the band to every gig until a couple of the dads helped out. Me that made sure they were out of bed at lunchtime to practice. Me that insisted we didn't need a fag break every 10 minutes at rehearsals, that our time might be better spent writing and learning material. In fairness, I could see why they weren't as dedicated as I was. None of them were living in a porter cabin in the middle of a garden centre with a certifiable nutcase who smashed things whenever he couldn't find the right drill bit. But it was still niggling at me. A few weeks back, I'd tried laying down the law to them. We were standing in the kitchen of our bass player Pep's house. His parents let us rehearse in the back room, on another bloody fag break. I'd suddenly announced that I was going to be as famous as David Bowie, and that the rest of them could either come with me or sod off. I suppose the idea was to spur them into action, but it didn't work. They merely looked at me, like you might look at a teenager who worked in his dad's garden centre and had just announced he was going to be Newton-le-Willow's answer to David Bowie. I'd stormed out. I walked home to the garden centre feeling like a complete twat. So where did that leave me? Not a clue. You try thinking straight when you've watched your brother threaten to murder your dad before you've even had breakfast. As far as I could gather, Mike's big idea for the future involved signing on the dole and waiting to see if anything came up. Perhaps I should join him. I didn't have any better plans,